Hello, my name is Alexandra Keiser, and I'm co-editor of the Archipenko sculpture Catalogue Raisonné. It is a great pleasure to share this session with Susan Cooke and Chris Stevens, who will be talking about David Smith and Barbara Hepworth, as well as Eleanor Nairne and Barry Rosen, who will discuss the Eva Hesse Catalogue Raisonné. This session is dedicated to the question to include or exclude. Building a catalogue raisonné is a complex and multifaceted endeavor. It not only means research, organization, funding, legal issues, and many other aspects, but also a constant process of communication and decision-making. Looking at the fabric of a catalogue raisonné, one of the main threads that weaves through its makeup is the question of what to include and what to leave out. This core question comes up on all levels, from the wider conceptual framework to specific content detail. For example, do we include essays or other interpretative writing? Do we include a chronology? Do we include or exclude works that have been destroyed or are unfinished? Do we include or exclude works that have not been examined? Do we include a conservation report, or is the decision to leave it out? What about missing or confidential provenance details? Do we make reference to forgeries? What about including archival material? And do we integrate the artist's own record keeping? We do in Archipenko's case, and this question makes me think of Barbara Hepworth's own cataloging, but also of Eva Hesse's diaries and David Smith's photography, of which we might hear later. And what about an appendix introducing tools and materials from the artist's studio? But more specifically for sculpture, do we include or exclude models and plasters? Do we include posthumous casts? And what about artist-made bases and supports? And on the detail level, do we list the date of conception as well as the date of fabrication? Do we include the name of a fabricator? The list of questions goes on and on. There are pros and cons, and I imagine as we move to digital media and NFTs, it will become even more complex. Looking at various examples of catalogue raisonnés, we usually find the standard main building blocks: details on the artwork, title, date, media, illustrations of the artwork, provenance, and exhibition and literature references. But from there, the catalogue raisonnés often take on different shapes, as distinct and creative as their artists. So while there are of course standards and best practices which keep evolving, there are many different and fascinating case studies to consider. I can speak briefly about the digital Archipenko sculpture catalogue raisonné, which is published at archipenkocr.org. The site was launched in 2018 as a dynamic and updatable platform, and it includes close to 2,000 works. It also includes an introduction about the history of the project and other content, such as a concordance, a glossary of terminology, and a guide to entries where we define clear qualifications for inclusion. We interlinked the site with the General Foundation website, which features a well-illustrated visual chronology of Alexander Archipenko's life and work. For its initial release, we decided not to frame the catalogue raisonné with interpretative writing, but the focus was on factual information that often had not yet been established and published previously. We envision our catalogue raisonné as a tool for varied audiences, including curators, collectors, and students. It is updated regularly as new information becomes available, and it is a very complex catalogue with an entry for each individual object in an edition, and it navigates complicated issues such as versions of sculptures, dates of conception, as well as dates of fabrication, and the inclusion of lifetime and posthumous bronze casts, as well as destroyed, lost, and confiscated works. To give you an example, I would like to discuss our entries for the work Madonna of the Rocks, a work from 1912. As you might know, Archipenko is credited with bringing new and different materials, as well as color, to the language of modern sculpture, in addition to using concave and convex shapes and the void as sculptural elements. In this work, the material is plaster painted red. He created it in the heyday of French Cubism while he lived in Paris. He would often exhibit a plaster or another cast material such as cement or artificial stone. This plaster has an interesting history. It belonged originally to Fernand Léger. After Léger's death, Archipenko bought it back in 1960 with the financial support of his New York dealer at the time. To some degree, Archipenko's artistic practice was marked by émigré experience. Initially, he left his hometown Kiev in Ukraine for Moscow and Paris, then stayed in the south of France and Switzerland during the First World War, and subsequently moved to Germany before a final immigration to the United States, where he continued a peripatetic lifestyle. For Archipenko, this wandering meant leaving behind in Europe numerous early works, including plasters, and some of them he could only access again in the 1950s. So it was only then that he started the majority of his bronze editions, as was the case for this work, Madonna of the Rocks. After he bought it back, he used it as a model for the bronze edition. In 1961, the first bronze was finished by Modern Art Foundry, and it's now in the UK at the National Museum, Cardiff. Archipenko completed only 4 casts in the edition of 6 before he died in 1964. His estate, under the supervision of Francis Archipenko Gray, then completed the edition. Generally, we include all posthumous casts created by the estate in our Catalogue Raisonné. With some exceptions, these posthumous casts were made to complete the edition started by the artist, and when still possible, the same foundries and often the same foundry workers made the castings and applied the patinas. The painted plaster from 1912 is now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And in our Catalogue Raisonné, you will find 7 entries for Madonna of the Rocks, 1 plaster and 6 bronzes. We try to fill in specific details for each individual work in an edition, including their dimensions, which are always slightly different, inscriptions, but also fabrication details, if known, including the casting date and foundry, as well as exhibition and publication details, which is a very difficult task, and photography. If possible, we include several images of an artwork. Sometimes these show different perspective, as in this example here, a bronze cast of Madonna of the Rocks, where it is so important to see the sculpture from more than one perspective. And sometimes we include archival and installation views as contextual documentation. For the future, we are considering including videos in select instances. Sometimes, though, it is not only the question of whether to include an artwork or a set of information, but where to include it. For example, we came across the challenge of categorizing multimedia constructions that play with the traditional borders between sculpture and painting in Archipenko's so-called sculptor paintings. An example is the work Red from 1957, a painted construction made out of wood and bakelite, and it has a turquoise stone as well. This concept of the sculptor painting goes back to Archipenko's time in Europe. An earlier example is the work Seated Woman, a painted papier-mâché and construction recorded as untraced. In the end, because they are three-dimensional objects, the decision was made to include them in the sculpture section. Moving forward, though, as we complete the cataloging of the two-dimensional work, we are looking to create a new layout that might allow us to read and navigate across traditional categories. In this case, for example, we would like to link the sculptor painting Seated Woman with two works on paper that reference the same imagery, a watercolor and an ink drawing. While many questions and decisions on inclusion and exclusion are relevant specifically to a sculpture catalog raisonné, they apply, of course, also more generally. As catalog raisonnés are evolving and more details become available and are being shared, I find that more demands are being made on their format and content. To end on a more philosophical note, I am interested in the collaborative and inclusive efforts that are emerging in the field. And from my perspective, coming from a digital catalog raisonné, so much more seems possible. That said, I am delighted to leave the introduction and share the virtual space now with the two conversations. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Susan Cooke. I'm delighted to be here. I was from 2013 to middle of 2018, responsible for the conceptualization, preparation, initial research, and editing of the David Smith Catalogue Raisonné of Sculpture. That project was actually carried to completion by Chris Lyon and by Tracy Ng, who did the research, Chris Lyon as the editor and project manager, and I'm happy to report should be available in bookstores in December. I'm currently working at Gagosian Gallery as project manager on the first monograph of work of Walter Di Maria, which is quite exciting.
Hi, I'm Chris Stevens. I'm director of the Holburne Museum in Bath. I was previously head of modern British art at Tate, and though I've never worked on a catalogue raisonné, I've done extensive work on the work of Barbara Hepworth, amongst other sculptors, and with a colleague, Matthew Gale, some years ago, we published a catalogue of the Tate's collection of Barbara Hepworth's works, which includes all the things in the Barbara Hepworth Museum in St. Ives.
Chris, we had talked, our title topic is to include or exclude, and I think we both agreed we were not going to talk about authentication. We're going to start from a basis that issue is well covered, and also we're talking about works that we all believe to be absolutely authentically by the artist, but the question becomes one more of sort of their existential identity as sculptures, as opposed to things or objects or non-sculpture physical things they made, and how one might go about determining that and categorizing them. And you, I think, have mentioned that Hepworth, for example, excluded her plasters during her lifetime as part of not wanting it to be seen as her sculpture. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, I guess with sculpture, there are two, well, I'm sure there are more than two, but two obvious sort of issues around what objects you include in a catalogue. Is sort of what is or isn't a sculpture, and I think we'll come to that later maybe, as opposed to some other object which a sculptor made. And then what the process of making sculpture often includes multiple objects, not all of which are finished works. And in Hepworth's case, my understanding certainly was always that she didn't see the plasters that she made to be cast into bronze as works in themselves. They weren't necessarily destroyed when she died, but there are plasters that, for example, when the Hepworth Museum was set up the year after she died, one or two plasters were put on display, in her greenhouse or in her old workshops, and have therefore, been allowed to deteriorate in a way that, finished works of art wouldn't have been. But then in more recent times, 10 years ago, the Hepworth estate donated a large group of plasters to really establish the Hepworth Wakefield, which opened in 2011. And so now I don't know whether they will be included in the Hepworth Catalogue Raisonné, but they are nevertheless, in the public realm in a way that sort of is really key to our understanding of her sculpture. So I think there's an interesting question we keep coming back to, is where the place that the artist's intent, whether stated or not, plays in how we decide what's included or excluded, and how the interpretation of that might evolve over time.
No, I think that shows up with David Smith, I think in a variety of ways, in terms of the considerations for the Catalogue Raisonné, the updating of the Catalogue Raisonné that Rosalind Krauss did. She had set out, hers was published in 1977, and she had set works, everything was called Sculpture Catalogue Raisonné, but in fact, she had 4 categories that she called sort of subcategories: the sculptures, the jewelry, miscellaneous works, and posthumous works. So that was a question of whether they were really sculptures, but somehow lesser sculptures, or if she just couldn't quite decide. And about the miscellaneous works, she was sort of designated them essentially as works that she did not see them as being fitted well into the overall development. They seemed to be one-off, or crude was the term she used. It was a bit of a pejorative term. And as we were working in the studio in Bolton and re-inventorying works, we found more of those types of objects that clearly had no record of exhibition, had not been sold, may not have been photographed by the artist, which he almost always did for certainly his finished sculptures, but formed enough of a body of work that, as you said about Hepworth, it revealed something about his artistic process and a kind of interest in experimentation and willingness to take the risks of creating works that might be considered dead ends or were simply experiments with material. So then the problem became, did they somehow at their core convey enough of an ultimate sculptural intent that it made sense to include them? And the final decisions were pretty parameters, and they were ultimately decided by Chris and the David Smith family. I think we're generous in a very selective way. That there were a group of he did wax casts, for example, in the 1940s. And for some of those, there are wax models still existing for the finished casts. In some cases, they're only wax models. They're quite beautiful, very small. He did not cast them. And it's whether, we don't know, I don't think whether it was a decision not to go forward, or money, or practical, obstacles. But they were included in the Catalogue Raisonné because they are sort of fully formed sculptural ideas, and yet also designated essentially as waxes, wax models. So the designation is a bit fudged in that sense, and I think in a good way.
That seems the right decision, but what was excluded? What kind of objects?
It's that were so fragmentary, that seemed more bits and pieces, perhaps, that had been in his working method, which was often welding together a kind of collage method to some extent with his welded steel. There might be elements that had initially been intended to be part of a sculpture, but then were excluded. It was so there were things like that were simply felt they didn't have any final integrity in and of themselves. If it didn't seem to sort of stand on its own, to have some sense of completeness as a shape or as a form, and couldn't be connected really securely to other works, so that it seemed almost literally unique as a physical object, that those were excluded. he also did some practical things like build towers to carry electric lines to Bolton in the 1940s. And although the towers are kind of triangular shape, that actually is quite, you can throw up a picture of one of his later stainless steel towers, and you think, was he thinking back to, or did he? And we know he had ambitions to create towers from his writings in the 30s. Nonetheless, the electric towers seem ultimately utilitarian and were not included in any aspect of the Catalogue Raisonné as sculptures. So
It's a really interesting illustration, though, isn't it, of where, even if it is utilitarian, there could still be an artistic intent somewhere.
I think had he decorated them, or had he finished them with a beautiful surface, or had he, sort of done something that elevated them a bit beyond the bare materials, that might have, swayed us to sort of include them, if not, with some designation that maybe qualified their, purpose in his work. But that wasn't the case. So.
And what was in the posthumous category?
Posthumous category was works that had been left in an unfinished state. They're stainless steel, where he had sometimes laid out the forms, but not yet welded them together, or tack welded some elements, but they were not complete and independent. And actually the estate, because his death was so sudden, he was in the midst of, he was only 56 when he died in a car crash, and he is in full production with multiple projects in process. But the executors decided, since it was very clear these had not been brought to a finished state, and it was working in a mode that there were many examples of what these might look like were they to be finished. But his studio assistant, Leon Pratt, did sort of erect them or complete some of the welding connections, but also inscribed on the surface, completed by Leon Pratt, dated, dated 1965, and made it quite explicit that these works, as you see them today, were had been completed by somebody else. Ultimately, my understanding is that the estate decided in the end not to include those works in the new Catalogue Raisonné, because perhaps feeling that too much of the final design decisions, it couldn't be determined whether the final arrangement of these independent geometric elements was truly David Smith or more Leon Pratt.
There was a similar case with Hepworth, actually, I think, because she also died suddenly. And there's a work in the Hepworth Museum. It's just one of what she was working on at the time of her death were sculptures made up of multiple marble forms, kind of arrayed on a base. And this sculpture has the forms on a base, but I think I'm right in saying that when she died, all the carvings were completed, but she hadn't yet come up with a base for them. And the base they're on is actually based on the turntable that she would have carved them on. And that's where they were when she died. So there's only a kind of assumption that is how she sort of envisaged them actually being assembled. So again, I mean, there might have been a case for that work being qualified in the same way that those posthumous Smiths were.
I think that's really interesting. And the question of bases, in particular, I think is something that sculpture Catalogue Raisonnés are not always carefully attentive to. And because it requires often a fair amount of research to figure out whether, especially a work that was sold during the artist's lifetime or to an institution, whether in fact the base you see it on has anything to do with the artist. So we did try to go back, and as I said, David Smith's photography of his work was very helpful and could identify carved bases that he created for many of his earlier sculptures. But we could also, and sometimes we could see documentation that he himself changed the base. And then we also realized that certain works that are in institutions or private collections at some point had lost their original base and were now installed in a different way. So the issue became how to illustrate those works in the Catalogue Raisonné. And again, I believe the final decision was to, when the base could not be certified as being David Smith's original base, then it was cropped out.
I mean, photography is a key thing in this, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of, I guess, because it's one of the things that is very different with sculpture than with painting. That there is obviously a photograph of a painting isn't the same as the original, but there's an approximation that you don't get with sculpture. And in your work on Smith, how have you approached that? You know, you said that he photographed everything himself. How did you use those original photographs, or his authored photographs, compared to others?
In many cases, the goal was to use as much as possible contemporary photographs. So there was a lot of new photography commissioned, in part because all of Smith's photographs were in black and white, and often so you lose a lot of the color of the materials. Many of the sculptures were painted, so it was really important to have those works illustrated in color. But often there was an auxiliary or a sort of ancillary image that was part of the catalog entry, so that you could see the work in its contemporary color photograph, but also see an older work, an older photograph by Smith that might be from a different angle, or give a sense of scale, that was different, or indicate a base maybe that had been lost in the, was no longer a contemporary one.
I guess they can, artist photographs can, they give you a clue as to where the artist sees their priority in terms of meaning, can't they? I mean, Hepworth, I think I'm right in saying in the 1930s, she was photographing her own sculptures, and also her husband, Ben Nicholson's. Well, they were really sculptures, his carved white reliefs, which, typically now you see those white reliefs photographed as if they're paintings, and they're quite flat and with little incident. Whereas in Hepworth's photographs of them, they're very strongly side lit. So often the texture is sort of weirdly exaggerated. So it draws out the fact that they are hand carved rather than some kind of, cold machine-like thing. And you see it in her own sculptures, that there are a group of sculptures from around 1933 where they're sort of biomorphic forms, but she incises kind of human elements like a profile or hands. And in the photographs that she took, they're far more exaggerated than they are in reality. So she either, I don't know, temporarily, kind of marked them with ink or something, or she worked on the photographs or the negatives themselves to highlight the fact. And it just emphasizes that these are figurative sculptures rather than abstract sculptures, non-figurative sculptures. And you see her doing it later. There are bronzes in her garden which she photographed or had photographed with the village church tower in the background. And notably, they're sculptures with a kind of religious theme. So she's sort of using photography to help kind of pin down, I think, a kind of intended interpretation.
That's fascinating.
But that's sort of different to how you might want photography to operate in a Catalogue Raisonné, which is more about recording the kind of actual physical detail of a thing.
But I think what's interesting about a Catalogue Raisonné, even if it's explicitly sort of limited to one medium, is by incorporating auxiliary imagery, sometimes process drawings or earlier models maybe that depart from the later work or the artist's photography. It is a way to, as you said, encourage a kind of conversation about how we see these works, and what are the various filters through which we see them, and how did the artist wish perhaps to direct our vision or comment on or cue us into certain connotations that might not be present. So I think there's a certain capacity in a Catalogue Raisonné to incorporate materials beyond just the strictest one image per object and one
Yeah.
stone kind of commentary. And with sculpture, I think you probably, ideally, you'd like to have multiple images because it is not easy to convey a work through a single point.
No, I'd have thought it was essential in a way. I mean, certainly ideal. That, I mean, I can think it immediately brings to mind a Henry Moore carving, sort of two-figure carving, which I think is in Philadelphia or the Hirshhorn. I can't remember. They're two pieces of Hornton stone that are always reproduced, you know, from a certain angle, and they're sort of vaguely figurative. And then when you go around the back, one of them has this amazing kind of wavy pattern, which I think must have been in the stone originally. It's like a beach when the tide's gone out. It's sort of, and it's extraordinary. But I don't think it's ever been recorded in, you know, reproduction. And yet, when you see the piece in the flesh, it's, you know, it's one of the most striking details.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, David Smith did sometimes paint the two sides of his sculpture different ways. I mean, and there, so that the color isn't in. You think if you only had one photograph, you would assume you understood what the back looked like, which is sort of what you're saying, and it is a surprise. And so certainly there was an effort to have multiple views as much as possible. It's a limitation print book that, and it's one of the, you know, in terms of the pros and cons, one of the arguments for digital catalog raisonné, particularly of sculpture, is that you can add more photographs more easily. You can show works installed in architectural settings that gives a certain flavor. You can, and it's a little bit, it's simply more costly to do that in the production of a book. And so, but I think the effort was made, you know, more often than not to have multiple images and to use the archival material as well as the contemporary, so that Smith's own voice was, in a sense, present. And that was also, in terms of the catalog entries, there was a fairly consistent effort to include comments and statements, sometimes technical, sometimes poetic, sometimes just factual, that he had written about a particular sculpture, so that you hear his voice in terms of sometimes explaining a meaning or sometimes just commenting about, you know, a work. They're short excerpts, but they also point people to resources that are available in greater depths in certain archives. And I think that's very good to be able to get in.
Yeah, no, completely. You need that sort of discursive accounting and the gathering of references, and particularly the artist's voice. I mean, thinking about that, you know, how the artist, how the sculptor controls or tries to control sort of interpretation through photography and what they say about a work. In Smith's case, so they're all, did you come across conflicts where they try to control what the canon would be? Were there works that were unmistakably by David Smith that David Smith tried to exclude from his catalogue?
The only example that comes to mind immediately, and he sort of was certainly never thinking about a catalog. I don't think my sense of him personally is that he was not, he certainly was making works for posterity, but he was not yet at anywhere near thinking about how to sum up his career. And I think he dreaded very much the idea that it was about a constant reinvention and the next challenge that really drove him to keep creating work. And he got very restless if he, I think, felt he was coming close to repeating himself. But when there were works that, there was a work that had been altered, repainted a color after it had been sold at a or promised to a collector, and I believe actually purchased by the collector. And Smith was just horrified and made it very public. He wrote letters to the editors of Art News and I forget, Arts Magazine, I believe, sort of denouncing this work, saying it was no longer his anymore. Ultimately, what happened was that he managed to get the work back. He painted it again, and it sort of reemerged then, since under his author, you know, as a work that he did display and recognized again after he had been able to restore it himself to what he felt was the proper appearance of the work. But damage to sculpture is a fairly frequent problem through transport and other accidents. And so in his letters, there are certainly comments about having to repair something. And sometimes that may have led to some slight consideration about, in the process of repairing, altering it a little bit further. I can't think of an exact example off the top of my head, but there was a sense that it, as a physical object, it is more vulnerable out in the world than your average painting, let's say.
Yes, sure. Yeah, yeah. No, I was thinking because in Hepworth's case, there's a point at the beginning of the 60s when it's not a catalogue raisonné, but she publishes a list of her complete work to date. And I think in preparation for that, her secretary had prepared there's this wonderful sort of resource of kind of files where there's a file on each work with a photograph and its exhibition history and where it's multiple, where the different casts have gone. But there is a body of very early work which is just doesn't appear there. And it's not, I mean, I don't know what the process was, but there are one or two kind of juvenilia pieces, sculptures she made as a teenager, I think, or as a student. But then there are others. There's a group of bronze nudes that she made, I think, when she was at the Royal College of Art in London, which clearly were finished enough that they were cast in bronze. But they were sort of, she didn't include those in that listing. So when they started appearing at auction in the, I first saw one in the 1990s, they came as a complete surprise to me, certainly. And then interestingly, there's a work, the Tate has a work called Fish, which it acquired, I think, again in the 90s, early 90s. And it's in that list of early works. It's not photographed, but there's a sculpture called Fish in ironstone, which is, 13.5 inches long. And a sculpture appeared with all those details, so the Tate acquired it. And then subsequently, I think Hepworth's executors found an exchange of letters from the 1960s between her and a dealer who had bought this sculpture and sent her a photograph saying, look, I found your sculpture Fish that you listed. And she writes back saying, no, that can't be by me. That must be by my first husband, Jack Skeeping. And I mean, I'm fairly certain that it is the Fish as it was listed. It seems extraordinary that the two artists would have made the same sculpture, exactly the same size and exactly the same material. But we had to catalogue it as a Skeeping and just tell that story of its reattribution at her hand.
I think that's part of the historic, that those of us who come after, I feel like we're honor bound to certainly respect the artist's wishes and pay attention to what they tell us about what they consider their work to be. But I do think there's sometimes, as you said, you lay out, the object exists. It's you can lay out the arguments. You can sort of give people context without giving them a final word. And I think that's part of what helps to keep, and that's true about all the whole function of the Catalogue Raisonné, that it is not the last word. I believe it's meant to sort of start a new conversation or help launch other conversations about what the work means, how it was done. And those answers, you hope, in a way, are never completely answered, because then people stop talking about the art and the artist, and that would be a shame.
Yeah. I guess it does bring out that question of what is the primary function of a catalogue raisonné? Is it a sort of tool for the market to know what objects have passed through an artist's hands or not, and which and where, or is it for a kind of scholarly audience who want to think about the artist's intention? If that makes sense, because
I would hope that Catalogue Raisonné really does speak to all those aspects. I think often the primary driver for creating one. It's either a family, in most cases, in my experience, with a strong desire to retain, perpetuate the legacy. There may often be a monetary interest in that ambition. And we understand that works that go out in the world and have a market also stay active and are shown. And so it's a system it's a capitalist system that helps to keep the artist alive in many ways. But I'd like to think that it's also art historians, apart from the market, who may learn information about an artist's, the works that artist did, but also their exhibition history, the history of their collectors, which is part of a social history, and certainly with exhibitions, which works get shown during the artist's lifetime versus which works perhaps gets shown more consistently after the artist is no longer alive. Tells you a lot about cultural attitudes about that artist and about art in general. So I think there's a kind of wealth of threads that different readership, as well as a more general readership, which is a bit more possible when you're doing a digital catalog raisonné, because you simply can reach a broader audience who's going to go to a scholarly library and pull down that 3-volume book and pour through it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I remember sort of struggling over how much detail was needed in that sort of tombstone information with works, not necessarily with Hepworth, but clearly it's desirable to have a list of ownership and exhibition. But we used to, when I was cataloguing at the Tate, list literary references to a work and then where they were reproduced without discussion, which is incredibly useful for a very obscure object or in the early, in its early years of existence. But I remember doing that for Francis Bacon's 3 Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion. The list of reproductions gets to 10 pages or something. And well, what does it matter after a certain point where this work is reproduced? It's ubiquitous. The other question that springs to mind is in thinking about sculptures. I mean, clearly in terms of ownership, you would list the ownership of each individual object, but where, for example, you have an editioned work, does it matter which cast is exhibited where or not?
I think it's interesting. I mean, I'll speak to Smith, because he made our task easier because his editions were small. And in fact, many of them never sold during his lifetime. So the estate still has them. And it's not such a problem to determine ownership. But he did distinguish his casts, for example, the Medals for Dishonor that he did in the 30s, that often each cast was had a different patina. Sometimes it had different inscriptions. Sometimes it had slightly different detail work that was added after the cast was first made, and he was sort of refining the forms. So they are distinctive if you look closely enough, and so they were illustrated in that case each object in the edition. When we tried to figure out which casts were exhibited, it was really helpful when there was, most of them had a kind of bronze finish, but one of them say had silver. So that usually was noted somewhere in the catalog. So at least we knew,
Yeah.
But often we didn't know which specific cast was exhibited if it was still in his hands. And certainly very rarely did, if it was mentioned in the critical literature of the time, almost never did anyone talk about some distinctive aspect. I don't think they realized that cast might have a distinctive aspects, because they didn't have the comparative examples. So again, your literary references were really more to the idea of the sculpture, not the specificity of the individual cast.
Yeah.
But that became complicated. Trying to figure out how you do that in your bibliographic histories was a chore.
Yeah, it gets complicated with Hepworth because most of her bronzes were made in plaster to be cast in bronze, but there are there are a number of works where she cast an earlier carving and then produced it as a bronze edition. So you can have a sculpture from 1943 that appears as a bronze in 1958.
Interesting.
And so, you know, it's the same shape, but otherwise it's a completely different idea. So there are all sorts of fascinating questions. I think the issues around Hepworth actually are fairly straightforward. And I guess, well, now I say that, I'm not so sure that it's, there is that question we started with about the plasters is the sort of most obvious challenge in a catalogue raisonné, because, you know, they were explicitly excluded from her canon and now are in the public realm. And that raises questions for those which aren't, that are still around but not cared for as if they were finished sculptures.
One of the issues about catalogue raisonné work as a scholarly project is, on its surface, the catalogue raisonné seems so straightforward. You have boxes and sort of categories to put things in, dates, media descriptions, dimensions, et cetera, et cetera. And when you get to the actual figuring out that for each object and then a lot of objects, it becomes so much more complicated and interesting. And you find you have to develop your own definitions, and I think be explicit about them when you're doing the work, because it's usually a team of people. Try to create definitions and standards that represent the artist, but also represent the challenges, and where you articulate them, and often then revise them as you go along with new information. And that then I'm always grateful when they're somehow articulated in the catalogue raisonné, and I think that's increasingly happening with the sort of glossaries and instructions to readers. And it's very helpful to know, how did they decide to do this or that?
Hello everyone, my name is Eleanor Nairne and I'm a curator at the Barbican Art Gallery in London. And I have a special interest in post-war American painting and art. And through that, curated a small exhibition that was in New York this summer of Eva Hesse and Hannah Wilkie, which was at the Aquavella Galleries. And while preparing that exhibition, I made great use of the catalogue raisonné, and also was lucky enough to meet and work a little bit with Barry Rosen. So hi Barry, and maybe you want to say a little bit about your involvement with the Eva Hesse estate.
Oh, well, I'm Barry Rosen, and I've been working with the Eva Hesse estate since 1978. So, you know, it's one of those lucky things in life where you see something, it means something to you, and then you end up being connected to it. So I've been very grateful for that. And I think in terms of our world of catalogue raisonné and just our work in general, we have worked very hard to grow the legacy of Eva Hesse and the scholarship around Eva Hesse. And certainly, even starting in '77, there was a kind of rudimentary catalogue raisonné of Eva Hesse sculptures in the back of the Lepard book. And that sufficed for a long time. And then someone called Jane Timken did one with Bill Barrett. And that was nice because it was all color photographs. But it turned out that both of these things had so many errors. And, you know, I mean, that finally we decided to do this.
Da-da-da.
And, you know, it's really trying to be as direct as possible so that it's a tool for people who are working on Eva Hesse and not an instruction.
So you're already giving us so many insights into where the project began. So the initiative was really about the fact that there were things that other academics and curators had done that were kind of approaching on a catalogue raisonné, but weren't offering the level of detail and were maybe perpetuating errors. So that was kind of where the project began, that you wanted to be getting information as correct as possible. And of course, because of Hesse's untimely death, you have a relatively contained body of work. So in that sense, you were probably a little bit spoiled about how much information you wanted to provide on each object, because I imagine that with some artists, they've been so enormously prolific that they have to exclude huge amounts, or they have to give very, very kind of top line information because there's just too much to cover. So
how can you
then
information? I mean, the whole point of a catalog raisonné is to gather that information, not to exclude it. And if you have somebody that had 1 million works, I mean, that's just tough. It's a longer, nightmarish process.
So if I think about the French artist, Jean Dubuffet, who decided that he was going to make his own Catalogue des Travaux, and he was never going to allow someone to do this after he died, he had 38 volumes of his catalogue covering his work. And inevitably, many of the things basically only have a title and a date and a medium, because there was so much work to get through that he couldn't give any kind of like detailed breakdown for a lot of the work. So when you were thinking about this project, you knew that you wanted to correct errors that had happened previously. What else did you want to provide scholars with? Did you think about whether you wanted to include sort of more curatorial style texts about interpretations of the works? Was that a possibility at one point?
Not really for us. I mean, the Timken catalog raisonné does that. Bill Barrett wrote a kind of interpretation of each piece, but they were completely incorrect. I mean, in one case, for instance, about the work Several, he said that it stopped her use of pairing and blah, 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 but it wasn't true. I mean, the whole thing was like 4 pairs or whatever. And he said there were 5. I mean, so there was just a lot. And I'm not sure that mattered. I mean, and that's a whole other topic. So for us, I mean, because we really are committed to new scholarship and new thinking, it's not for us to say, and we didn't want to just repeat old saws or whatever the expression is.
So maybe what you're getting at here was that you were also a little bit worried about being then considered as the gospel text. That if you wrote an interpretive piece for each object, that would then be taken as scripture, and it might inhibit then future research being done that could open up in new different interpretive directions.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and I just think that it's a great source of information. As you said, you used it when you made your exhibition.
Extensively.
When we're working on the exhibition, it's even good for us. So, I mean, you think you could just do it by memory, and I don't think, I just trust scholars, and I think that, people think, and that's the whole point, is to give people an ability to look at something, see what the history of it may have been, and maybe that has importance to somebody. You don't know that the history, like the exhibition history, really does, but because a lot of, in our case, things are repeated over and over. I mean, we've had kind of the same exhibition 100 times, and I just stopped letting them happen. Because I just think it's so much more interesting to have people think, have new ideas. And I don't even care if I agree with them. When we had our Yale show, Helen Cooper, who was from American art and not from contemporary art at all, did a catalog with 5 essays that were very, very different. And people hated that catalog, but it was great because it broke the stranglehold of Lepard on the interpretation of Hesse.
Interesting.
And I think it's really important to have ideas, and our job working with Legacy is to foster that, not direct.
So one of the things I love about the philosophy of what you're saying is that it feels to me like it has a relationship to the way in which Hesse spoke about her own work, in which she was very hesitant to allow particular kinds of vocabulary to become fixed in relation to the work. And she always wanted to allow this really kind of generative space around how the work would be interpreted. So, you know, when we encounter some of those interviews, sometimes it's almost frustrating because she's kind of going round in these big circles around the work because she doesn't want to. And I think someone like Darby English has been brilliant at kind of describing the logic of how she does that. She doesn't want it to become reductive, basically. So it feels to me like there's a way in which the spirit of how you approached the Catalogue Raisonné for the sculptures was also trying to be true to her spirit of how she wanted the work to be thought about or spoken about, and to allow space for very different kinds of encounter. I mean, were you conscious of that when you were working on the project, of how she might have approached it?
No.
Okay.
I mean, you know, I work with a number of artists' estates, and I think that the responsibility working with estates is quite different than that working with living artists, or in the case of Dubuffet, or your own work. You know, I mean, you can't necessarily believe them. And I think especially, you know, I just think it can be very simple, and I think that they're important and useful. And I think the technology for doing this work has changed tremendously. I mean, we started working on our Catalogue Raisonné in 1990, and we were lucky enough to partner with Museum Wiesbaden, and they had a reason to do it. But you know, on the other hand, they didn't have technology. I mean, we had stacks and stacks of pieces of paper that shuffled from, you know, one place to another and all that. And now I think it's a lot cleaner and easier to do because everything is inside the computer, basically.
So in terms of just going back to some of those, the question of errors. So I think one of the things that was quite complicated with Hesse's work is she obviously works with very hybrid media, and she was very experimental in terms of the kinds of materials that she was using and working with, and probably some of that, I imagine, you only really learned about through the process of doing the Catalogue Raisonné, that when you were doing that kind of close looking. And were you working with conservators on that as well, I imagine?
Yeah, we have a great conservator called Martin Langer who lives in Germany. And in fact, he was a conservator at Wiesbaden and left and went back to university, I guess, and did a specialty on Hesse materials.
Wow.
So he knows everything about all these synthetic materials and all these things.
Which is particularly important because Hesse inspired generations of artists who've gone on to use Hesse-style materials. So those conservation skills are going to be necessary for a long time to come.
Well, also the mistaken idea that it's all especially fragile and can't be seen, and can't be in the air, and can't all these things. It's not true. Yeah. It's just not true. And I think some of that really dates from the people in the 60s who were, you know, caretakers of Hesse moving forward. But even in the early papers from Fischbeck, I mean, it just turns out that what they wrote on the receipts was not true in terms of material. I mean, you would think there were tons of things that are sculpt metal, but there aren't. I mean, most of those things that were down as sculpt metal were really gray paint on top of paper mache.
Right.
You know, I mean, so people didn't know, and then whatever they didn't know became the truth for a long time. And we really made an effort to cut through that. And I think everybody doesn't have to do that because people keep better records now. People know more about their own work. They're willing to admit it. I mean, you know, we know that in Rothko's case, you know, he put eggshells and eggs and all kinds of things in the paint, but, you know, nobody wanted to admit this, but it takes conservative.
Well, yeah, Rothko famously was very secretive about his materials, not least because later on in his life, right at the end of his life, he's working with acrylics, and that was a very sacrilegious gesture for one of the first generation abstract expressionist artists. So the last thing he wants anyone to know is that he's working with plastic paint, you know?
Well, and now, I mean, initially when people started using computers to do things, nobody wanted to admit it. I mean, Ida made these great pieces and they were basically printed out. But, you know, everybody invented a new word for printout, basically, or ink. So who are you like? did this piece in Jerusalem that was made out of plastic, basically, and he made up a name for these chunks that was like, what was it? Polyvitro. I mean, he just made it up.
So if you were to be, you're talking a little bit about how it was then in terms of the sort of sloppiness of record keeping, and also it must have been enormously labor intensive in 1990 to be sort of shuffling all the paperwork to the conservator in Germany and back again. And if you were to be embarking on this project now, and I'm thinking a bit here of some of your fellow colleagues and friends who are going to be at this conference, who are in the throes of conducting this research now, what is there anything you would have done differently if you were approaching this project again now?
I don't think so, really. I mean, because we're working on the drawing catalog Raisonné now.
Of course, yeah.
And, and it's 1,000 works. And, that would have been impossible in this manual way of doing things. I mean, it's not impossible, but you can imagine how that would be so
very
much
challenging.
Yeah. So no, I don't think so. But, part of that is because of my feeling about what's important in terms of working on these artists. I mean, I think people do things in another way. Maybe if they think the money of the whole universe is more important than the content of people's work. But I don't feel that way. I mean, I really want people to think. That's my goal, is to give people tools to think with.
And are you, in terms of just the structure of how you're organizing the Catalogue Raisonné for the drawings, will that mirror the structure for the sculptures, or is it different in any way?
Well, it's a 5-volume thing, basically, as we broke it down. And no, it's the same body of types of information. It's identical, really. It's very straightforward. In a way, the drawings have more complex histories than the sculptures do. And also in the sculptures, it's, I don't know, about 100. I mean, one of the things we did was, whereas previously all these things known as test pieces were just one number and nobody identified them. And I just thought, if we're doing this, we have to do every one of them. And so we expanded the number of works in the considerably. And I think it's a good thing, because it means that there's more to look at and more to think about. In the drawings, and also in Hesse, everything virtually went through the estate, because she sold very little when she was alive. So almost all of her work we have records of. So, but the drawings move around more, of course.
So being able to track that provenance is a little bit more of a complicated piece of work by comparison. And will, on the question of inclusion and exclusion, do you feel that the drawings Catalogue Raisonné will be really exhaustive? Is that every work on paper that she made, to your knowledge? Is there anything you're not including in that scope?
We're not excluding anything. I mean, there have been things that people brought us that were insufficiently documented, and so we didn't include them. But as you know, you can't say it's not real. So I don't know, that part of it has become so legalistic and crazy that I think it's a disservice for, future scholarship. Seems to me. I mean, I think people should be able, but on the other hand, there have been so many scandals where they just did whatever.
Yeah, and it's a very complicated situation for estates, deciding whether they want to have an authentication committee or how they want to go about trying to offer some
nobody
kind of
will
sense
do
of.
Because it has too much liability.
Yeah, well, most places have disbanded any kind of authentication committee, partly because they're worried about litigation action being taken against them. So it's a kind of, it's definitely one of the least palatable aspects of having to be running an estate, I think. Going back to this question of materials and which works are no longer in the same state as they once were, because Hesse was, some of the materials, not all of them, some of the materials she was interested in working with do age and have aged. would you ever think about reissuing the Catalogue Raisonné with some sense of what those objects look and feel like now, you know, sort of a family photo album 30 years on? Or do you feel it's better to hold on to the elixir of youth and keep them as they were kind of originally intended in their heyday?
To show that process, because the other thing that we've learned is that, for instance, with latex, it oxidizes to a certain point and then it stops oxidizing and it's stable. And, you know, the myth that, you know, there can never be an Eva Hesse show because all these things, but it's not true. We've had like 4 exhibitions, including latex things.
Yeah.
In the last 20 years, I got. And no, I think we have pictures of new things, you know, new pictures of things too. I mean, we're not hiding anything. I mean, and I don't see it as another material. It just is what it is. I mean,
I think that's so important and really, really encouraging to hear, actually, because that's also about us kind of not carrying with us cultural presumptions about what these objects are and how they will age, and allowing ourselves to be responsive to being surprised and being like, you know, we thought this object was made of sculpt metal, but it's not, you know, and we thought it was going to age like this, but it didn't. And this is how we've listened, and this is how we now treat it as an object.
Yeah, but you know this from paintings. I mean, paintings that are 50 years old are not the same as when they were brand new, but that doesn't mean it isn't real.
No, and it's sometimes a question that we ask when we're reproducing a painting in a catalogue, for instance, is, are you trying to adjust that repro to make it look like the painting in the flesh, or to make it look like what the painting feels like for you? You know, are you trying to kind of revert, you know, how much are you kind of taking out the wrinkles and the kind of crow's feet? So just sort of to close up, I guess, you know, thinking imaginatively of your fellow travelers on the Catalogue Raisonné journey, it's obviously a really kind of epic project to embark upon. If you were to impart one piece of advice, whether it be a piece of wisdom or courage for the road, what would you say to your fellow travelers?
Tell the truth. I mean,
that's
it's
a great kind of Jenny Holster aphorism. Barry Rosen says, "Tell the truth."
I don't know.
With great power comes great responsibility.
It's the easiest thing to do. So, and it's what we have to remember, it's not for us, it's for the future.
Absolutely. Well, I think on which note, that's a perfect moment to end. And thank you so much for this little conversation. And thank you for all your scholarship and work to date, because as someone who has made extensive use of that Catalogue Raisonné, you know, all the love and energy that you poured into it really, really paid off.
Great. Thank you very much.